Today we're going to focus on the impact of the Second Industrial Revolution on the United States. And the Second Industrial Revolution is a time period that witnessed some very revolutionary changes in manufacturing, transportation, and communication technologies and practices within the United States. It's a period that begins around the end of the American Civil War, so right around 1865, and continues until basically the first decade or so of the 20th century, so right around the 1900s. And again, it's this period that sees these very important changes in the American economy as well as in the American society. The American economy shifts from a focus on agriculture and trade, which had been the driving forces in the American economy since the end of the American Revolution, to ultimately a focus on manufacturing. We call this process industrialization, which is the shift from agriculture to an industrial or a factory-based economy. And so this process of industrialization is what really shapes the development of the American economy and American society during this time period. It also witnesses the development of new technologies such as electrification, the internal combustion engine, for example, new sources of power that drive businesses as well as consumer products. It also we see the growing ability of mass-produced consumer items, items that are familiar household names to this day. And of course, all these changes do have a very negative impact on workers, because before the war, a majority of people were in agriculture. By the decade or so after the war, more and more people are increasingly in wage incomes where they're working for hourly wages as opposed to simply working for themselves. And ultimately, by the end of the century, the vast majority of American workers have gone over and are working for wages. And so there is a negative impact that we'll talk about in just a few minutes on American workers because of this process of industrialization. Well, to speak for just a minute in general terms about industrialization, one of the first things we're going to talk about today is how the economy in the United States becomes an industrial economy and what leads to the growth of these large businesses in the United States. After the Civil War period, we see the growth of large companies, such as we have just a quick example featured here. Companies that go from employing dozens of people, perhaps in small factories, to employing hundreds, if not thousands of people. In fact, by the late in this period, it's not atypical to see a company employing 10,000 workers, perhaps scattered across the United States. So it's important to keep in mind that as the nation becomes more industrial, businesses just get bigger and they become more powerful and more integrated within the U.S. economy. The U.S. goes from being a relatively small player in terms of world production to, by 1913, becoming one of the biggest single industrial nations in the world and producing nearly a third of all industrial output, which is just a tremendous figure. Well, one of the reasons why there's such a dramatic growth in the industry and business during this period is that the United States, as a society and as a culture, rewards people who are involved in this technical and this commercial process. So people like Thomas Edison here, with the development of the light bulb, are hailed as national heroes. They're seen as great figures. And so American society is very willing to praise people and reward them financially for developing all these important new technologies and being successful in business. This is also a period where the federal government plays very little role in regulating the economy. The dominant economic philosophy is laissez-faire. And this is a French term that essentially means leave it alone or leave it be. And this is really the idea that the federal government assumes during this period is leave these businesses alone. Let them develop on their own. Don't interfere with them. Don't try to regulate them. Don't do anything that might slow their growth. Well, as a result of this, of course, it leads to, in a sense, a Darwinian struggle between businesses. It's a survival of the fittest. And the biggest companies begin to outgrow the smaller companies and ultimately take them over or destroy them. And so it's a period of very much unregulated commercial growth that leads to both negative social, negative economic, and even negative environmental consequences as businesses just grow bigger, faster, and without any concern for the people that they're hurting in the process. Well, to talk briefly about these big businesses, because of course big business is what dominates the American society during the American economy during this time period. What we begin to see is companies that go from employing a few hundred workers during the Civil War period as again going to employing thousands, in some cases 10,000 or more workers, which is just a huge change. The dominant industries that really drive a lot of this growth are the steel industry, here featured on the left, and petroleum, development of oil production, featured on the right. Both of these industries play a very important role in driving the American economic growth during this time period. Companies also begin to organize in new and different ways. One of the important things that helps lead to companies getting bigger and more powerful is the development of the corporation as a legal and kind of economic idea. Before the Civil War, most companies were organized as partnerships. A couple people would get together, pool their money, and create a new business. So after the Civil War, the corporation becomes the best way of organizing. Corporations were legal entities. They essentially had all the rights as people. They issued stock and had investors. And in many cases, they were considered to be a limited liability, which meant that if you were one of the managers or owners of the company and the company went bankrupt, you couldn't be held personally responsible for all the money that had been lost. That was the investors' money, and that's the risk that they took. And so this allows companies to get bigger and more powerful and avoid having to deal with, for instance, all the legal problems if they go out of business or do other things like that. Another aspect of many of these companies is how they grow. Companies no longer grow just organically, in other words, just on their own. Instead, they're managed and they're supervised by employees. And so oftentimes research and development becomes a very important part of these companies. Research labs are organized to create new products or develop existing products into better products. Companies are also spread out further, and so the company might be headquartered in New York, might have steel mills or other operations in places like Pittsburgh, Toledo, Detroit, for instance, might have mines in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or in Minnesota. It might also have business operations in places like St. Louis or Denver or the West Coast in LA and San Francisco, but yet all these operations are connected together through railroad lines, through the telephone and the telegraph, as we'll talk about here more in a minute. And in a sense, businesses, because they're able to spread out more, they're able to be more powerful. And this allows companies to grow and have a workforce of 10,000 or more people, and yet maintain kind of simple control over the company. Another aspect of how corporations grow is that they grow in new ways. And one of these ways is the idea of the trust. A trust was a business that controlled other businesses, and typically what there would be a holding company at the top. That holding company would hold stock in lots of smaller businesses within one industry, and it would allow it to basically exercise complete control over that industry. So the holding company at the top here is really what's running the show, and they could create essentially a virtual monopoly within an entire industry just by owning all the stock. Well, of course, these trusts become the subject of great hatred among many people in the United States. John D. Rockefeller, who owned Standard Oil, was often depicted as in this image as the python, gobbling up parts of the United States, of businesses, creating this massive corporation that controlled so much of the American economy. The company itself, Standard Oil, is often depicted as the octopus. It has these tentacles that control Congress, that control manufacturing, control the people. And so there's increasing frustration over the size and power and the corruption of many of these companies. Ultimately, these companies use two ways of getting so big. One is they use vertical integration. Vertical integration is when a company takes over every part of a manufacturing process. So, for instance, the steel industry, you would own the mines, you would own the steel mills, and you would ultimately own the distribution operations. And this allows you to exercise a great deal of power over the industry. Horizontal integration was another process where you would own every part of one particular production process. So, for instance, in the oil industry, you would own every single pipeline, or you would own every single production operation. And that meant that you could set prices on whatever you did, and it made you very, very economically powerful. So ultimately, these corporations come up with these new ways of organizing, and by doing so, it allows them to exercise huge control over the American economy. And this is one of the reasons why these companies are able to grow so big so fast. Well, the second area I want to talk about are transportation and communication networks. As I've already mentioned, the railroad and the telegraph and the telephone are very important in allowing these corporations to grow nationwide, to be able to communicate with each other, to be able to move goods around the country inexpensively and quickly. And it's the railroad that ultimately leads to this beginning of this process of spreading out throughout the nation. The railroad network is very important in the United States. Before the Civil War, most railroad companies are operated independently. They don't even connect to each other. They are operated with different gauges, and a gauge is the width of the track. And many railroads had different gauges, which meant that trains from one company couldn't operate on tracks owned by another. During and after the Civil War, this begins to change. Bigger companies acquire smaller companies. They begin to create networks. Companies began to standardize gauges, and ultimately by 1886, what they do is they create a standard gauge that allows all railroad companies to connect to each other. And so trains beginning in New York City or Boston can ultimately travel all the way to Chicago without people having to switch tracks or switch to different train equipment. We also begin to see the development of new rail lines connecting the West. And so we have additional transcontinental railroads. This is the first transcontinental railroad, but additionally we begin to see lines connecting the southern part of the United States, connecting the South, and ultimately connecting parts of the Northwest. And so by the 1890s and the 1900s, America is just crisscrossed with railroads, and each of these major transcontinental lines has small branch tracks coming off of it, connecting all these communities throughout the Midwest and the Western states. So America becomes a railroad nation over the course of the 19th century. Similarly, with the telegraph and later the telephone, we see communication playing a very important role. Western Union becomes the dominant monopoly communications company. They take over many of the smaller telegraph lines after the Civil War and allow for, if you want to do business, if you want to send a telegram from one place to another, you have to use Western Union. Similarly, once the telephone is created in 1876, then we see the creation of the Bell Company and eventually long-distance service through the AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph. So these new communications technologies additionally provide business services and allow corporations to grow bigger, to expand, and also still be able to communicate with each other effectively. Well, another aspect of this industrial revolution is we begin to see the development of new and different consumer goods. And one of the most important aspects of consumer goods is the development of branding. Branding is the idea that you create standard brands that you sell nationwide. This is an era when we see the development of brands such as Quaker Oats, Ivory Soap, Crisco, products that are still familiar to us to these days. And this is an era when these companies like General Mills and Procter & Gamble develop these products. And they develop them specifically so that they have a standard shape, they have a standard packaging. And what it tells Americans is that if you buy Quaker Oats in Ohio, it's going to be exactly the same as if you buy Quaker Oats in New York City. This, of course, is very different than buying products at the local general store where you typically just reached into a bin and pulled out whatever you could get out of that bin. And it might be good, it might be bad. So companies use branding as a way of telling consumers that they can trust their products, that they're all standardized. They are the same no matter where you go. And this, of course, leads to a decline in general stores, and instead those general stores are replaced by new kinds of retailing establishments. The department store, for instance, Montgomery Ward, who creates some of the first department stores in the nation. We also see Sears and Roebuck and Company, who actually begins as a mail order catalog, and then later creates department stores as well to compete against companies like Montgomery Ward. And these were places you could go and be assured of high quality brand name goods. No longer would you have to go to the general store and just reach into a bin and pull out whatever you could get. Now you can go there and you can be assured of the fact that you're going to get high quality standard products that you know and that you trust. Well, the negative side of all this economic growth is that the workplace experience, the experience for people working within these businesses, becomes much more difficult, more demanding, more dangerous during this era. One of the first things to mention about the workplace is it becomes far more decentralized. In other words, workers no longer know who their bosses are. They don't know who the owners of the company, because they don't have direct interaction with them. Instead, they're dealing with foremen, they're dealing with lower level managers. In fact, they might not even be working in the same city as the boss anymore. The boss may be in New York City and they may be in Pittsburgh or Cincinnati or Cleveland or Chicago. And so the workplace becomes a far more depersonalized location where just workers are there. No managers, no owners are present. By the early 20th century, as I've already mentioned, workers tend to work in large workplaces. The factory oftentimes employs 250 people or more, as opposed to a generation earlier when factories might employ 20 or 30 people. And with this process of factories getting bigger, factories getting more and more people working in them, we also see the prevalence of de-skilling. And de-skilling is the process of creating equipment and manufacturing technologies that don't require skill to operate. Skilled workers are replaced with unskilled workers, including children, including women who lacked lacked skill necessary to do manufacturing, but no longer was that required because companies can simply employ whoever they wanted to as long as they knew how to operate a simple machine. And the machine had all the skill. The employee no longer had any skill. Well, with this process, of course, the environment of work changes as well. And what we begin to see, hard physical labor, long hours, 60 to 90 hours becomes a typical work week. Actually some businesses, we begin to see a 24-hour work period. Some, like the steel industry, require every 2 weeks you have to work a 24-hour shift. And so as a result, we have these very important changes in the level of work. Work becomes more dangerous, becomes more demanding. Workplace accidents become just a common aspect of everyday life. Companies do everything they can to avoid liability for those accidents. And so for workers, this becomes a very difficult, very dangerous environment that they have to negotiate in order to survive, in order to earn the money that they need to pay their bills. So along with the positives, with this growing businesses, with growing consumer goods, we also have to acknowledge the negatives. So the second industrial revolution definitely leads to some very significant negative consequences for people living within the United States during this era.